On the cover of Miami Herald, the headline in large letters shook the city. Victor Salazar's empire crumbles amid bribery scandal. Millions watched on TV as federal agents led him away in handcuffs, with the blank look of someone who knew that secrets kept for decades had finally come to light. But the question was inevitable. How did a seemingly untouchable man, the owner of a fortune valued in the billions, get to this point? Victor Salazar built a secret empire on the foundation of corruption, illegal contracts, and shady alliances with politicians. For years, his Miami mansion was the scene of lavish parties, while bribes flowed in champagne glasses. Now, allies became enemies, and betrayal arose from within the family itself. What you will see here is not just the fall of a millionaire, but the X-ray of an inevitable collapse. Stay with me until the end, because every detail of this lost fortune reveals that when greed rules, ruin is only a matter of time. Victor Salazar was born far from the luxury he would later flaunt. The son of Cuban immigrants, he grew up in the humble neighborhoods of Miami, where he learned early on that power isn't achieved through effort alone, but through the right alliances. From a young age, he cultivated boundless ambition, dreaming of beachfront mansions and vaults full of money. That boy didn't just want to win, he wanted to dominate. His first legitimate business was a small construction company, but profits were too slow for his ambitions. Victor wanted a quick fortune, and it didn't take long for him to discover that shortcuts lay in the corridors of politics. Discreet bribes opened doors that would have seemed unreachable. Each check signed in silence was a key element in strengthening his empire. Soon, million-dollar public contracts began to fall into his hands like marked cards. Highways, bridges, and skyscrapers in Miami bore his signature. Behind each grand project, however, lay secrets hidden in leather briefcases, hidden in golden vaults. Victor knew he was playing a risky game, but he believed himself invincible. Over time, his life became a spectacle of luxury. Mansions valued at tens of millions, gold-plated yachts, parties where champagne flowed like endless rivers. On the surface, a model of American success. Behind the scenes, the architect of a network of corruption. The contrast between appearance and reality was as great as his fortune. Political allies multiplied, mayors, governors, and even senators owed favors to Salazar. He was the kind of man who didn't need to shout to be heard. A silent look, accompanied by a folder of contracts, resolved any issue. For many, Victor wasn't just a businessman. He was a shadow ruling Miami. But within his own home, the atmosphere was not one of eternal celebration. His children, Adrian and Isabella, grew up surrounded by luxury, yet intoxicated by the feeling that nothing was enough. Victor gave them imported cars and trips to Europe, but denied them the one thing they wanted, trust and a place in the empire. The seed of betrayal was beginning to germinate. Isabella, the eldest daughter, inherited her father's charm and her mother's cold, calculating nature. She knew more than she let on and collected information like rare gems. At parties, she discreetly observed conversations and recorded every detail. She knew that secrets were more valuable than any diamond. Adrian, on the other hand, was the rebel. Young, impulsive, and power-hungry, he believed he could run the business even more boldly. But his father never handed him the keys to the empire. For Victor, trust was a scarcer commodity than oil. This rejection fueled Adrian's dangerous desire to see his father fall. Meanwhile, Victor's wife, Elena, maintained a facade of perfect wifehood. But behind the scenes, he harbored resentment. He knew about her lovers, her betrayals, her shady dealings. He kept copies of documents in unexpected places. She, too, had her own vault of secrets, ready to be opened at the right time. The empire seemed unshakable, but it was increasingly supported by rotten foundations. The greater the fortune, the heavier the secrets became. And in Miami, a city that never sleeps, betrayal can come from any corner, from any ally, even from within one's own family. Victor believed he controlled everything, but he was blind to the most important detail. Greed cannot be controlled. It can only be disguised, and when he least expected it, this invisible force would begin to corrode his empire from within. Victor Salazar cemented his name in Miami as synonymous with power and fortune. His face graced business magazines, his presence dominated political events. But behind the scenes, the wheels of his empire churned along with dark money and favors. The luxury he displayed was the visible tip of an iceberg of corruption. At his lavish parties, champagne was just a detail. Politicians, business people, and celebrities circulated beneath golden chandeliers, exchanging confidences to the sound of soft music. Every toast concealed a negotiation, every smile masked a debt of loyalty. Victor knew that secrets were more valuable than any contract. In safes, hidden behind false walls, Victor stored documents that could topple governments. They were black folders sealed with codes, containing evidence of bribes and powerful names. This trove of corruption was his most lethal weapon, and at the same time, the time bomb that could destroy his entire empire. The city of Miami seemed to bow before him. Banks offered him unlimited credit, mayors called asking for favors, and businessmen sought his blessing to close deals. Salazar not only accumulated wealth, he controlled the game. But greed always demands more, and this pushed him to take even greater risks. On one of his trips to Las Vegas, Victor expanded his connections with the casino underworld. Money laundering became routine, disguised as colored chips and million-dollar bets. There, he struck deals that expanded his power beyond Florida's borders. Corruption became international, and its secrets even more dangerous. Meanwhile, Elena, his wife, cultivated a calculated silence. At dinners, she smiled perfectly, but in her diaries she recorded every betrayal and every slip-up. She kept copies of suspicious contracts in safes outside the mansion. She knew that one day this collection of hidden truths could be her salvation, or her revenge. Isabella, the eldest daughter, observed everything like a watchful disciple. She had access to the offices, read contracts, and realized where the dirty money was hidden. She knew the family fortune was not just the result of business dealings, but also of political betrayal and illegal agreements. She kept this awareness silent, waiting for the right moment. Adrian, on the other hand, lost himself in late-night parties and impulsive decisions. He spent millions on gambling, showed off imported cars, and made enemies in the underworld. For him, fortune was merely fuel for fleeting pleasures. But deep down, he harbored a grudge against his father, who never recognized him as a worthy heir. Victor saw his sons as both a threat and an opportunity. He wanted them to inherit the empire, but he was suspicious of their intentions. In private meetings, he tested their loyalty with false information, gauging who could keep secrets. It was a dangerous psychological game, where trust was confused with manipulation. The circle of allies was also beginning to fragment. Partners who had once toasted success were now wary of the risks. A multi-million-dollar contract in Washington drew too much attention, and journalists began to sniff out inconsistencies. What had once been a source of pride was now a trail of gunpowder. With each new deal, Victor fueled his obsession with control. He installed surveillance systems in his own mansions, recording conversations without guests' notice. He transformed luxury into a gilded prison. His secrets were so valuable that any slip-up could cost not only his fortune, but his life. One night, during an intimate dinner, a drunken senator blurted out too much. Adrian, eavesdropping, recorded every word on his cell phone. For the first time, he had something in his hands that could blackmail his own father. The betrayal, previously latent, began to take shape. Victor didn't realize it immediately, but he was already being watched from inside his own house. Isabella studied his movements. Elena collected evidence. Adrian sought shadowy allies. Each family member had their own agenda, and they all orbited around the same fortune that was now becoming a curse. At the same time, a Chicago investigative journalist was receiving anonymous tips about Salazar's fraudulent contracts. Photos, spreadsheets, and mysterious letters arrived in envelopes with no return address. The empire was beginning to leak through the cracks, and secrets once kept in vaults were now echoing in newsrooms. Victor still felt untouchable. In interviews, he spoke confidently, displayed generosity in public donations, and presented himself as a philanthropist. But behind the scenes, every charity check was just a smokescreen. Corruption corroded his soul, and not even his fortune could buy peace of mind. One morning, upon opening his main safe, Victor discovered a disturbing detail. One of the folders had been moved. Nothing was missing, but someone had tampered with it. His heart sank. He knew only 3 people had access to that safe: Eleanor, Isabella, and Adrian. This doubt was the harbinger of an inevitable betrayal. The tycoon grew suspicious of everyone. He hired private detectives to monitor his own family. He installed hidden cameras in the hallways. The mansion, once a symbol of luxury, became a prison. And in the center of that gilded prison, the fear that secrets would finally come to light grew like a suffocating shadow. Victor's empire seemed ever larger on the outside, but on the inside it was fragmenting. His political alliances, his family, and even his coffers were no longer trustworthy. He believed himself the conductor of a symphony of power, but he was beginning to realize that perhaps he was merely the protagonist of an inevitable tragedy. On a muggy Miami morning, Victor received an anonymous letter. The black envelope had no return address, but inside were copies of contracts signed with powerful politicians. Beside it, a single sentence written in red: "Secrets always find the light." It was the harbinger of an invisible war about to begin. Victor locked himself in his office, twisting the gold ring he always wore when closing shady deals. The document revealed not only his corruption, but also secret payments made to members of his own family. Someone had stolen information from his safes. The betrayal was at home. Elena entered silently, observing her husband's distress. "You look worried," she said with a cold smile. Victor didn't respond. The silence between them carried more weight than 1,000 words. She knew too much, perhaps everything. She kept evidence, diaries, and contracts hidden in a secret apartment in Brickell. Isabella, feigning innocence, approached her father that afternoon. "If you need help, I'm here for you," she whispered. But her gaze betrayed something beyond loyalty. It was the calculating coldness of someone who saw her father's downfall as a chance for advancement. She was already exchanging confidences with lawyers and journalists in discreet meetings. Meanwhile, Adrian searched his father's room for more evidence. He found a safe key he didn't recognize and kept it as a trophy. For him, it wasn't just anger, it was revenge. His disowned son now held in his hands a piece of the puzzle that could bring down the entire empire. That week, a Chicago journalist published the first story, "Bribes in Miami, the Dark Empire of Victor Salazar." The report didn't name any politicians, but it made it clear that billion-dollar contracts were tainted by corruption. The headlines spread across social media, tarnishing the tycoon's image of perfection. Victor gathered his lawyers for a private dinner, demanding they uncover the source of the leak. But the more they investigated, the more they realized there were many loose ends. Documents were mysteriously disappearing, copies were leaked to independent blogs. The castle of secrets was beginning to crack on all sides. Elena watched from the front row. In discreet conversations with Isabella, she suggested that mother and daughter protect themselves. "Your father built his fortune on corruption," she said, "but we don't need to go down with him." Isabella silently agreed, but she was already making plans to seize the throne, even if she had to do it alone. At the height of the pressure, Victor called a family dinner. The table was immaculate with silverware and rare wines, but in the center was a white envelope with a new will. He wanted to prove he was still in control. "My fortune will only go to those who prove themselves loyal," he declared. Tension hung like invisible smoke. Adrian was the first to react. "Loyalty?" he said dismissively. "You've never been loyal to anyone, not even your own family." The words cut through the room like a sharp blade. Elena remained silent, but her eyes burned with satisfaction. Isabella simply watched, calculating every gesture, every silence, every splash of wine against the glass. Victor opened the envelope and read startling clauses. Half the fortune would go to Isabella, provided she remained single for 10 years. Adrian would receive only a small percentage, with strict restrictions. Elena would be left out entirely. The will was more than a document. It was a weaponized emotional bomb. The silence lasted seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Elena got up and left without a word. Adrian slammed his fist on the table, spilling wine onto the white tablecloth. Isabella smiled discreetly. This unequal division was not only unfair, it was fuel for future betrayals. The will, which was supposed to seal power, now ignited resentment. That same night, a safe in the mansion was broken into. Victor found the padlock broken and papers scattered on the floor. Among them was a mysterious handwritten letter. "The fortune you protect will not be yours for long." The tycoon felt for the first time that he was losing control of his own empire. Meanwhile, journalists received anonymous dossiers, copies of contracts, photos of secret meetings, bank statements from tax havens. Salazar's name now echoed not only in Miami, but in Washington and New York. The conspiracy went from a whisper to national headlines. Victor tried to fight back. He bought silence, intimidated reporters, threatened former partners, but the truth no longer fit in the coffers. It was like sand slipping through his fingers. The more he tried to hold on, the faster it slipped. The corruption that had made him powerful was now becoming his greatest enemy. The FBI began investigating. Discreet agents watched his every move, parked cars appeared near the mansion, and employees were questioned. The empire that had seemed untouchable was now under siege. Victor knew it wasn't just the government against him, it was his own secrets, leaking out like poison. Elena arranged a secret meeting at a luxury hotel. She was greeted by a man in a dark suit and discreet tie, handing her a black briefcase. Inside were copies of contracts and compromising photos. "Protect my daughter," he said. It wasn't just revenge, it was survival. Betrayal, finally, had become an irreversible action. Adrian, on the other hand, sought allies in the Las Vegas underworld. He offered stolen documents in exchange for favors and protection. But in dealing with mobsters, he didn't realize he was becoming a puppet in an even more dangerous game. His rebellious son was creating his own downfall, believing he was gaining freedom. Isabella, silent, wove her own web. In discreet meetings with lawyers, she planned to legally take over part of the fortune, alienating her father and brother. She used charm, intelligence, and secrets as lethal weapons. Each calculated step was a move on the board that could transform her into the queen of a collapsing empire. In the press, pressure only increased. Headlines described millions in bribes, political connections, and fraudulent contracts. The name Salazar was now synonymous with corruption across the country. Banks began freezing accounts, partners cut ties, and investors fled. The collapse of the empire was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. Victor, alone in his office, stared at the gilded portraits hanging on the walls. In each photo, a false smile stood next to politicians who now denied him. The silence in the house was suffocating. He reached for a bottle of whiskey, but the taste was bitter. The wealth that had once intoxicated him now tasted like poison. In the early hours of the morning, he received an anonymous call. A hoarse voice simply said, "We know everything, and we are not alone." His heart raced. It wasn't just a threat, it was a sentence. Victor understood that his enemies were already inside and outside his own home. His empire was no longer a fortress, but a sandcastle. The will, which was supposed to cement his power, now served as a trigger for a family war. Isabella, Elena, and Adrian were not allies, but invisible rivals. Each kept their own secrets, each plotted in silence. The empire he built with bribes was being destroyed by the greed of those he trusted most. The following week, a lavish party was scheduled at his mansion. Victor believed he could demonstrate strength, gather allies, and restore his image. But behind the silk curtains, everyone waited for the next scandal. The dinner that was supposed to be a celebration would become the stage for fatal revelations. The city's atmosphere was one of anticipation. Journalists parked vans outside, drones hovered overhead, and neighbors whispered. The Salazar name had become a spectacle. It was more than the downfall of a tycoon. It was a public display of how fortune and secrets can turn into a curse. The day before the party, Victor walked the halls of the mansion in silence. The sound of her footsteps echoed as if she were being fired. Upon opening the most secure safe, she realized a crucial document was missing, a contract signed in Washington. The paperwork proving her bribery ring was gone. It was the beginning of the end. On the day of the event, as musicians tuned instruments and waiters prepared champagne, Victor knew he was no longer the host, but a prisoner of his own creation. The conspiracy had reached its peak. The turning point wasn't just a suspicion, it was the certainty that his fortune would be his ruin. The party night began with a bang. Luxury cars lined up in front of the mansion, while journalists waited outside. Inside, golden chandeliers illuminated every corner. But the real spectacle wasn't the decorations, it was the masks everyone wore to hide their intentions. Victor descended the central staircase, looking every inch the host. He wore an impeccable suit, a measured smile, and a steady gaze. Around him guests toasted, but behind the smiles were murmurs of suspicion. Everyone knew his fortune was under investigation. The man who had seemed like a king now smelled of ruin. Elena, dressed in a dark green dress, moved among the guests with eerie calm. She touched shoulders, whispered confidences, and observed every reaction. To many, she was just the discreet wife. But in truth, she was the one holding the most dangerous pieces of the game, copies of secrets kept for years. Isabella, dressed in vibrant red, became the center of attention. Young business people approached. Politicians sought her smile. She responded with calculated charm, but her goal wasn't to garner superficial attention. She harbored bigger plans, to take over the empire when her father fell, using against him the same secrets that sustained him. Adrian, meanwhile, drank too much. He paced the halls with a provocative smile, muttering inconvenient truths. He approached Victor's old allies, offering bits of information in exchange for favors. With each uttered sentence, he created larger cracks in the wall of silence that protected his father. In the main hall, politicians laughed loudly, but their eyes were uneasy. Some had already received calls from federal investigators. Others feared their names would surface in the leaked documents. For many, Victor was no longer a powerful ally, but a living threat. The instinct was clear: cut ties before it was too late. One of the senior partners, Richard Cole, approached Victor. In a low voice, he said, "The press knows about contracts in Washington. If this continues, they'll drag us down with it." Victor replied curtly, "I'll handle it." But Cole's look betrayed the trust that had been broken. The circle was beginning to unravel. As toasts were raised, undercover journalists captured discrete images. Photos of the party would circulate on social media the next morning, accompanied by scathing headlines. The tycoon smiling amid corruption suspects. The spectacle wasn't just private, it became public, amplified by invisible cameras. Elena found Adrian near the library, a glass in his hand. "Can't you see you're destroying yourself?" he asked. He laughed bitterly. "I'm just anticipating what's going to happen to all of us." Before she could answer, he showed her the stolen key to the safe. The revelation made Elena's blood run cold. Isabella, meanwhile, was talking to a discreet lawyer in the garden. "When the fall is inevitable, we need to act quickly," he said. The man nodded, holding a black briefcase. Inside were documents that could legitimize her rise to part of the fortune. Her daughter was already paving the way to become heir to a shattered empire. Victor sensed something was wrong. The mood wasn't one of celebration, but of silent judgment. His guests, once fawning, now kept their distance. The champagne was tasteless. The music seemed discordant. It was as if everyone was waiting for the exact moment he would stumble in front of them all. At the height of the night, a projector displayed unexpected images on the hall wall. Photos of contracts and bank transfers appeared before everyone. Someone had hacked the mansion's system. The scandal was now exposed in real time. Murmurs filled the hall. Victor paled. Who had dared reveal his secrets? Chaos ensued. Some guests left the hall in a hurry, fearing they would be associated with the tycoon. Others stared at Victor with cold eyes, as if observing a standing corpse. For many, this was no longer a party, but the symbolic funeral of their reputation. The empire was beginning to crumble before everyone's eyes. Isabella took advantage of the confusion to approach a journalist present. With a cold smile, she discreetly handed him a card. "When you want the real story, come find me." It was her final move, to become a reliable source against her own father. Her daughter was no longer just an heir, she was an accomplice in the conspiracy. Elena, meanwhile, found Victor in the hallway. "You've created your own downfall," she said quietly. He tried to respond, but she continued, "I won't go down with you." And with that, she calmly walked out of the mansion. The wife, who had maintained a perfect facade for decades, now revealed herself as his most dangerous enemy. Adrian, drunk, climbed onto a table and shouted, "This is my father's empire, bribes, betrayals, and lies." Some guests laughed nervously, others recorded it on their cell phones. The words echoed like a public sentence. The rebellious son was signing the patriarch's final statement before witnesses. The FBI, already investigating, received videos and documents that very early morning. Every image from the party became evidence. Every recorded word fed into dossiers. What had previously been suspicions now became concrete evidence. The conspiracy ceased to be an inside game and became a federal case. Victor gathered his few remaining allies in his private room. "If I fall, everyone falls with me," he threatened. But no one responded. Their gazes were cold, calculated. He realized there was no loyalty left, only self-preservation. Those who had once applauded him were now planning how to survive the fall. The next day, newspapers in Miami and New York published photos of the party. "The night of the exhibition," read one headline. Victor was no longer an untouchable tycoon, but a public villain. Society's opinion was turning against him. His fortune, once a source of admiration, was now a symbol of corruption and decadence. Isabella gained space in discreet interviews, always maintaining the air of a concerned daughter. "My father made a mistake, but I hope the truth prevails." Behind her sweetness, she delivered calculated information. She gained the media's trust while burying her father's reputation. She became a key player in the empire's downfall. Adrian sought protection from mobsters in Las Vegas, offering stolen secrets in exchange for safety. But the price of loyalty in the underworld is high, and he soon realized he was being used as bait. His son, who wanted freedom, was now trapped in blood debts with even more dangerous men. Elena, cold, moved to another address with some of the documents she kept. In secret meetings with investigators, she exchanged information in exchange for immunity. Her voice, previously muffled, became the final blade against Victor. The betrayed wife transformed resentment into a devastating weapon. Isolated, Victor began to distrust even his own guards. He fired long-time employees, changed passwords, and reinforced systems. But the real enemy was no longer outside. The conspiracy had its roots within his home, in every glance, every silence. He was a prisoner in a castle surrounded by ghosts. The politicians who once owed him favors now publicly cut ties. Speech after speech, they denied involvement, placing all the blame on the tycoon. Victor watched on television as the same men he had bought disowned him in front of the cameras. It was the price of political betrayal, being abandoned at the first sign of fire. In closed meetings, banks froze accounts, companies terminated contracts. His fortune was shrinking rapidly, like water evaporating under the Miami sun. Victor tried to resist, but it was like swimming against the current. The empire built on decades of corruption was now crumbling in weeks. At the height of the conspiracy, Isabella was invited to testify in secret. Her testimony could seal her father's fate. In the darkened room, before lawyers, she spoke calmly about contracts and transfers. Her firm voice didn't tremble. Her daughter was now an official accomplice in the ruin of her own blood. Adrian, increasingly lost, disappeared for a few days. Rumors said he was in Las Vegas. Others claimed he had fled to Mexico. Victor desperately searched for his son, but not out of love. He feared he would hand over crucial documents in exchange for survival. The family bond now posed a mortal threat. Meanwhile, Elena discreetly appeared in interviews with trusted reporters. She never made direct accusations, but she did leave sentences laden with insinuations. "Not everything that looks like success is clean," she would say. Her strategy was clear: destroy her husband without directly dirtying her hands. She manipulated the narrative like no other. The net was closing in: federal investigations, family betrayals, allies on the run. All that remained for Victor was paranoia. Every knock on the door felt like a sentence, every anonymous call a threat. The tycoon who once controlled everything was now controlled by fear. His fortune had become a gilded prison with no way out, and on the horizon, the climax approached. A trip, a dinner, a final attempt to prove his power to the world. Victor still believed he could turn the tide, but he didn't realize that all the pieces were already stacked against him. The conspiracy had grown too large. The end was no longer a possibility. It was only a matter of time. Victor hosted an exclusive dinner at his Miami mansion, trying to prove his power. Select guests included prominent politicians and businessmen. He wanted to show his strength. But every suspicious glance at the table betrayed that, in reality, everyone was expecting his downfall. The table was impeccable: gleaming silverware, tall candles, crystal glasses, but the atmosphere was heavy, as if each guest were attending a wake. The host tried to smile, but his expression betrayed weariness. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded him had vanished. Elena, dressed in a black dress, couldn't hide her coldness. Beside her, Isabella exuded calculated confidence. Adrian, already drunk, laughed loudly, oblivious to the surroundings. The family was no longer a symbol of unity, but a spectacle of betrayal. Every gesture revealed deep cracks. Halfway through dinner, Victor raised his glass and said, "This fortune is still mine, and no one will dare destroy it." The words echoed, but no one responded. The piercing silence was proof that he no longer had allies. He was a king speaking to subjects who had already abandoned him. Suddenly, a projector turned on by someone mysteriously displayed new images. Documents with bank transfers, photos of secret meetings, proof of bribes. The room filled with murmurs. Victor's secret empire was being exposed piece by piece before their very eyes. Adrian stood up and shouted, "He bought you all! Every contract here was paid for with dirty money!" The audience of guests reacted with shock. Some tried to calm him down, others filmed the scene. Victor paled, staring at his son. The betrayal he had feared was now blatantly obvious. Isabella then stood up. In a firm voice she said, "Father, we can't pretend anymore. These secrets need to come to light." She handed a black folder to the lawyer present. Inside, evidence that completed the corruption puzzle. It was the final blow. Her daughter had become a snitch on her own family. Elena remained motionless, but her eyes shone with satisfaction. She had already chosen her side. She didn't need to say anything. The papers spoke for themselves. The woman who had kept silent for decades now let her husband be consumed by his own greed. The hall descended into chaos. Guests left the table, undercover journalists recorded every second. The dinner that was supposed to reaffirm power turned into a public trial. Victor, at the center, seemed smaller than ever. His gilded empire crumbled like a house of cards. Outside, blue and red sirens approached. The FBI, alerted in advance, raided the mansion. Agents entered, interrupting the night with firm voices. "Victor Salazar, you are under arrest for corruption and money laundering." The tycoon didn't resist. He simply slumped his shoulders in defeat. Adrian laughed, a nervous, empty laugh, like someone savoring bitter revenge. Isabella remained serious, aware that her position was now strategic. Eleanor turned her face away, emotionless, as if everything had been written long ago. The family was shattered forever. As Victor was handcuffed, journalists captured images that would go around the world. Headlines would appear within minutes. The fall of the empire of bribery. The tycoon who once ruled Miami was now paraded before the nation as a criminal. His fortune no longer bought him silence or respect. Inside the mansion, the still untouched banquet reflected a cruel irony. Luxurious dishes, rare wines, and classical music mingled with the clang of handcuffs. The contrast between wealth and ruin was so stark it seemed like a scene written for a movie. But it was real life, and the ending was inevitable. Victor tried to look at his family as he was led away. He sought compassion, but found only distance. Isabella regarded him coldly, Adrian with contempt, Elena with indifference. The three no longer saw a patriarch, but a man defeated by his own corruption. As he passed through the mansion's door, Victor took one last look inside. The gleam of the golden chandeliers reflected like a cruel reminder. Every marble stone, every million-dollar painting, every goblet was a reminder of a fortune built on bribes and destroyed by betrayal. Outside, neighbors watched in silence. Some recorded with their cell phones, others merely whispered. The man who had once been a model of wealth was now a spectacle of shame. The collapse of an empire is never silent. It is accompanied by the hungry gazes of the crowd. As he was loaded into the agent's car, Victor muttered to himself, "It's not over." But deep down, he knew it was over. His fortune was lost, his secrets exposed, his family against him. The gilded empire had become a dark prison. Inside the mansion, Isabella collected the empty briefcase. He knew the future was now in his hands. He was already planning his next steps, controlling some of the remaining assets, rebuilding his image as a victim. For her father's collapse was merely the beginning of a new chapter. Adrian, staggering, disappeared into the hallways. His fate was uncertain. Some said he would flee to Las Vegas. Others believed he would eventually be consumed by his own mistakes. The rebellious son didn't seek power. He sought only revenge, and that revenge had already been fulfilled. Elena climbed the stairs slowly. In her bedroom, she opened a personal safe and took out an old diary. It recorded decades of secrets, betrayals, and bitter memories. She closed the book and smiled. She no longer needed proof. She had the silent victory of seeing her husband destroyed. The mansion, now empty, seemed haunted. Music interrupted, dishes intact, bowls broken. The luxurious setting had become a symbolic ruin. It was proof that no fortune can survive when built on corruption and betrayal. The climax had been fulfilled with cruel perfection. Outside, helicopters broadcast live footage. Millions watched on television and commented on social media. The public trial had already been decreed before any court could even begin. Victor wasn't just being arrested, he was being condemned by the relentless gaze of society. The mansion clock struck midnight. The night Victor believed he was reasserting his power turned into the night of his final downfall. Every secret revealed, every betrayal exposed, every mask removed. The climax wasn't just a spectacle, it was a definitive sentence. And so the dinner ended without applause, without toasts, without celebration. It ended in a heavy silence, punctuated by the distant sound of sirens. The fortune had changed hands, and the empire of bribery disappeared before the incredulous eyes of those who had once admired it. The next morning, newspapers across the country carried the same image. Victor Salazar handcuffed, being led away by federal police. Headlines ranged from "The King of Corruption Falls" and "Bribery Empire Crumbles in Miami." The man who was once celebrated was now a national disgrace. In front of the mansion, dozens of reporters crowded together, microphones in hand, searching for any detail. Helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting live to millions. The gilded luxury was now the stage for a grim spectacle, a symbol of the collapse of a fortune sustained by dirty secrets. Isabella emerged from the mansion hours later, surrounded by cameras. She wore black, feigning mourning. "I hope justice is served," she declared with a measured expression. Her image went viral as that of the courageous daughter standing up to her father. Little did they know that she had been a central figure in the conspiracy that destroyed him. Adrian didn't show up. Rumors abounded that he'd fled to Las Vegas, taking suitcases of cash. Others believed he'd been kidnapped by mobsters to whom he owed favors. His absence only reinforced the air of mystery, as if he were the ghost of an empire doomed to disappear. Elena was spotted at an upscale Brickell cafe, calmly chatting with lawyers. She was in no hurry, showed no fear. Those who watched her swore she looked relieved, as if she had been waiting her whole life for this moment. For the first time, she was not in her husband's shadow. The media explored every detail of the fateful party. Photos of the dinner circulated on social media, transformed into memes and cruel jokes. The tycoon, who had once represented success, was now a caricature of decadence. The public judgment was harsher than any court. At the federal prison, Victor was given an orange uniform and taken to an isolated cell. The man accustomed to sleeping on silk sheets now faced cold walls and a thin mattress. His wealth couldn't buy privileges. Every second in that cell was unbearable psychological torture. Meanwhile, investors withdrew capital from companies linked to him. The market reacted with a decline. Partners desperately tried to erase their names from contracts, denying past relationships. The financial collapse spread like a domino effect, hitting hundreds of businesses connected to the tycoon. Protests erupted on the streets of Miami. Posters with slogans like "Soiled Fortune," "Wounded City," and "The Truth Always Wins" echoed. Society, which had once applauded his lavish parties, now spat indignation. The empire of bribery was crumbling not only in the mansion, it was crumbling in the heart of the city. TV shows explored every detail, interviewing former employees and neighbors. Revelations about betrayals, lovers, and secret parties became daily news. Victor was reduced to a scandalous figure, a living example of how greed destroys even the most powerful. Isabella used the exposure to shape her image. In interviews, she spoke of protecting her family and seeking justice, but her eyes betrayed cold calculation. She knew that the greater her father's misfortune, the greater her public rise would be. Her daughter turned tragedy into a springboard. Elena struck deals with investigators, granting immunity in exchange for evidence. She presented files, recordings, and diaries kept secret. Her narrative was that of a silent victim, a betrayed wife who never condoned corruption. In reality, she played the game masterfully, clearing her name. In his cell, Victor received letters from former allies. They weren't supportive, but threatening. Powerful men feared he would speak too much. His survival no longer depended on lawyers, but on keeping his own secrets hidden. The tycoon discovered that prison was less dangerous than the world outside. The symbolic funeral of his reputation took place days later. In New York, a photo exhibition featured headlines about his downfall. It was treated as a case study, how a gilded empire built on corruption and betrayal could disintegrate so quickly. His name had become synonymous with ruin. At business schools, professors discussed his trajectory as an example of what not to follow. "Fortune is not power when it is born of bribery," read one lecture broadcast online. Victor's legacy would not be remembered for his achievements or wealth, but for the corruption and greed that devoured everything. Adrian finally appeared in an obscure recording, circulated by blogs. He appeared dejected, surrounded by armed men. He asked for money and promised secrets in exchange for his freedom. The image went viral, transforming him into a tragic character. The rebellious son was now a victim of his own recklessness. At the mansion, doors remained closed. The estate, once a symbol of grandeur, lay empty. Abandoned lawns, dark windows, a heavy silence. Luxury had turned to ruin. The house was a living reminder of how an empire built on dirty money and betrayal always ends in ruins. Victor Salazar's collapse wasn't just that of a man, but of an era. The tycoon who manipulated politicians, bought allies, and amassed a murky fortune was now just a number in a criminal case. The spectacle of his downfall had become a public lesson. When greed rules, destruction is inevitable. Victor stared at the grey walls of his cell as if they were distorted mirrors of his mansion. The silence was broken only by the metallic clang of the bars. The man who commanded billion-dollar contracts now shared his space with his own solitude. The fortune that defined him had evaporated. The first night, he dreamed of his gilded vaults, filled with contracts and gold bars. But when he woke, he found only a worn mattress and fluorescent lighting. The contrast hurt more than any court ruling. The empire that had seemed eternal now existed only in tortuous memories. Letters arrived from the family, but they weren't supportive. Isabella sent legal notices, seeking control of the remaining assets. Elena wrote nothing, only sent lawyers. Adrian was missing. Victor, for the first time, understood he had no allies. Betrayal had become his only inheritance. He began pacing in circles inside his cell, murmuring the names of politicians and businessmen. He feared they would silence him before he could speak. Every noise in the corridor felt like a threat. Paranoia turned the prison into a constant nightmare. The powerful tycoon was now a prisoner of his own fear. Guards watched with indifference. To them, Victor was just another white-collar criminal. The yachts, the mansions, or the lavish parties didn't matter. Here, everyone was equal. This indifference hurt more than contempt. It showed that his fortune was no longer valuable. At night, he wrote down everything he remembered from the contracts on scraps of paper. He jotted down figures, dates, names. He tried to maintain control, as if he could still manipulate the outside world. But no one read them, no one responded. His secrets were now just forgotten scribbles. Time seemed to drag. Without golden clocks, he counted the minutes by the sound of doors opening and closing. The man who had accelerated million-dollar deals now saw the days become endless. The empire he had built in haste was slowly dissolving, corroding his mind. In his delusions, Victor imagined parties taking place in the mansion. He heard laughter, music, and toasts, but when he opened his eyes, he saw only cold walls. The contrast between illusion and reality slowly destroyed him. The gilded prison was not made of luxury, but of memories that tortured him. The FBI visited him periodically, trying to extract confessions. He hesitated, fearing reprisals from former allies. He knew many would rather see him dead than exposed. With each question, he felt his life was worth less than silence. The lost fortune couldn't protect him from oblivion. Victor began to talk to himself, repeating phrases from the past. I control everything. I control everything. But he no longer controlled anything. The walls of his cell were his only audience. The man who had dominated politicians, businessmen, and the entire city was now just a man, broken by his own corruption. In the end, Victor realized the cruel irony. He had spent his life building fortress-like mansions, but ended up confined to a cramped cell. His gilded empire had become a concrete prison. The man who sought eternity found only solitude and ruin. In the newsroom of Miami Herald, a final edition was printed with the headline in bold letters, "The Empire of Bribery has come to an end." The same image of Victor in handcuffs graced the cover, completing the cycle that had begun days earlier. The tycoon, once king of Miami, was now merely a model of ruin. In his cell, Victor remembered the night he heard the sirens approaching his mansion. The reflection of the red and blue lights on the palm trees had marked the beginning of his downfall. It was as if that scene had never ended, merely replayed in his mind like an endless curse. The mansion remained closed, silent, an empty symbol of a luxurious past. The once impeccable lawns were covered in dry leaves. The city that had applauded him now rejected him. That gilded castle, once the site of millionaire parties, had become a monument to corruption and betrayal. Elena, Isabella, and Adrian followed separate paths, but all were bound by the same stain. The fortune that was supposed to unite them destroyed the family. Betrayal was no accident, but the inevitable result of greed. Each inherited not wealth, but scars, memories of an empire doomed from the start. Victor closed his eyes and smiled bitterly. He understood too late that secrets don't sustain eternity. Fortune can buy silence, but not loyalty. The final downfall wasn't just his imprisonment, but the legacy of shame he would leave behind. Thus the cycle closed. The empire built on corruption crumbled to dust. Victor Salazar's story reveals that fortunes built on corruption are castles made of sand. The glittering mansions, the overflowing coffers, the millions of bribes, all fall apart when secrets come to light. Nothing lasts forever when it's built on betrayal and dirty money. Greed not only destroys empires, but also erodes family bonds. Elena, Isabella, and Adrian showed that even blood can be weaponized when fortune becomes a curse. In the end, there was no loyalty left, only psychological ruin and poisoned memories. Victor believed himself untouchable, but his downfall proved that no one is above the truth. Silence can be bought for a time, but not forever. His lost fortune serves as a warning. Empires of corruption leave no legacy of glory, only a legacy of shame. And perhaps this is the ultimate lesson. Secrets always find light, and betrayal exacts a heavy price. Dirty money can build palaces, but it can't buy peace, love, or true loyalty. Victor's fate is proof that the truth always wins. If you believe stories like this need to be told, stay with us. Here, every hidden fortune, Every revealed secret and every downfall of a tycoon shows us that power and corruption always have the same end: ruin. Subscribe, share, and continue discovering what hides behind the glitter of riches.